Galatians chapter 1. And if you remember, this isn't any particular church. This is a series of Christian churches in an area that was settled by the Gauls. And so they later on called it the area of the Galatians. Once again, in chapter 1, Paul emphasized the fact that his apostleship was not of man. You know, the other apostles that were handpicked by Jesus, clearly, he picked them, and he picked Paul too. But he kind of had to almost fight for his recognition or fight for his credentials over and over again. Probably at first because he was such a persecutor, but then even later on, seemingly because of his physical appearance and his lack of charisma, I guess, the enemy really got a lot of folks against him when he traveled. He told the churches in the area of Galatia that, he was so surprised that they were removed from the gospel to another gospel, and that they were being misled. Then he gives in verse 12 in the first chapter of Galatians, kind of gave his resume. Key verse there is, neither I received it of man, verse 12, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. So his training was different. He already was an expert in the matters of the law, and then the Lord caught him up and revealed things to him in a supernatural way, without really interacting with the other disciples very much. He went, after 3 years, verse 18 told us that he went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and he stayed with the apostle Peter for 15 days. But then none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, did he have any interaction with. But then they began, he was unknown by face to the churches in Judea. They didn't know who he was. In that day and age, of course, there were no internet, telegraphs, pictures, anything like that. Now in chapter 2, he goes back to tell a story that happened in Acts. Let's look at it, chapter 2, verse 1. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation. Here again, no man asked him to go up. God did. And he just simply says, I went up to Jerusalem by revelation. God led, and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run, or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. This was the next struggle. The next area was, remember, I've said several times that they wanted to compartmentalize Christianity as part of Judaism. And that's not what it is. That's not what it was ever intended to be. So now there's going to be a struggle where the new Christians from the Gentile world coming in are being told, no, you're not really part of the family because you're not circumcised. And that became a problem. He describes his trip. The 14 years he's referring to was about 3 years after the Damascus Road experience. And again, he was led there. He demonstrated that his gospel came by revelation, not by man. And then he talks about two men that really meant a lot to Paul, Barnabas and Titus. Really trusted them. They traveled with Paul to both Jerusalem was Barnabas. Titus was a Gentile convert, and Barnabas was also respected among the leadership. If you go back to Acts chapter 4, verse 36 and 37, we find out. One author says, Titus was a remarkable man and associate of the Apostle Paul. A surprising number of passages show us that Paul loved and trusted Titus. I know we know his name, but I was surprised when I studied how many times his name is mentioned. In 2 Corinthians 2, Paul refers to him as Titus, my brother, and how he had had no peace since he had been gone. You know, if a lot of things, if someone's with you to do them, it's better. And that's how it was with Paul. When Titus wasn't with him, there was something missing. 2 Corinthians 7, Paul says he was comforted by Titus arriving. In Corinthians 8, he trusted Titus to receive the collections from the Corinthians. Same chapter, he said that Titus had the same earnest care that filled the heart of Paul. And then Paul said, if anyone in 2 Corinthians 8, if anyone asks about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. And he shared his heart. He said, did we not walk with the same spirit, he and Titus? Did we not do the same things? And then in Titus 1:4, Paul calls him a true son of our common faith. So, when you hear his name, just remember Titus and Barnabas were fellow workers. So, God told him to go to Jerusalem to preach among the Gentiles. As we know, Paul was mainly the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter the apostle to the Jews, as far as their specialty, their area of expertise. Verse 4 of Galatians 2. And that because of false brethren, unawares brought in privately to spy out our liberty which we have in Jesus Christ, that they may bring us unto bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Already, we talked about this in the last couple months, false brethren had crept in. They did not wear signs saying, hi, I'm a false brethren, I'm a false teacher. They purported themselves to be genuine and true. And in this passage, Paul says that they came in unaware to spy out our liberty, to see what was going on, and to corrupt and to change things. He realized that, and Paul said that they were not going to give up. Verse 5, not even for an hour were they going to stop teaching what God had conveyed to Paul by revelation. Verse 6, but of those who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it makes no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. So Paul has met those who were purporting themselves to be something in the faith. And Paul says they didn't add anything to me. He goes, if whether or not they were something in God's sight, it doesn't matter. As far as he was concerned, no big influence on me. They didn't help me. He just didn't seem like he thought much of them, and no wonder, because many of them weren't genuine, and apparently Paul saw right through them. Especially when they began to try to pervert the gospel by saying you need to be circumcised. Now imagine that. You're a grown man. In order to join the church, you need to be circumcised. How silly. As a child, that's one thing. It set the Israelites apart. It was commanded by Moses. But in the New Testament, but that's what they were saying. And it was kind of a way of keeping out those they didn't want to be. Remember, there was still that jealousy or that prejudice of the Jews toward the Gentiles, because they thought they were the only ones. They couldn't see Gentile inclusion. They thought that our God is for only the Jews. The Old Testament inferred Gentile inclusion, but it didn't really come out and say it until the New Testament. So there were some prejudices there. There were some disagreements and fighting. But I like how Paul says that in verse 6, that God doesn't accept any man's person. He doesn't say this person's better than this person. We're all one in Christ Jesus. And verse 6 ends, he says, even those that said they were something, they didn't help me, didn't add to me, didn't add to my knowledge, didn't encourage my faith. They just didn't seem to be that. Verse 7, now we get into it. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. In other words, he's ministering to the Gentiles, and they see that Peter's ministering to the Jews. Same salvation, same rules for both now. Just two different men that God used to two different groups of people. Those of the Jewish faith and those who weren't of the Jewish faith. Verse 8, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. Verse 9, and when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they unto the circumcision. So they're splitting the job up to preach the gospel. It's a different group of people. The Jewish people are acquainted with God's law. Gentiles were not. So in some ways, it was easier for the Gentiles to accept faith in Jesus than it was for the hardcore Jew who several generations, many generations, had observed the law of Moses. So I can understand why it was tough for them. I really can. And why sometimes it was easier for a Gentile who'd never been trained about the law of Moses and the sacrifices and the circumcision, the feasts. So two different men ministering the same gospel, but to two different groups. And Paul said in verse 8, he worked just as strong in me as he worked in Peter with the group he was ministering to. I like the fact that when he talks about Peter, James, and John, if you remember, those were the three disciples that saw things the others didn't see. The inner circle, we call that. They saw the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus said and showed those three some things that the other 9 didn't get to see. So he said, James and Cephas, verse 9, and John, who seemed to be pillars. In other words, they were highly respected. And they finally perceived in Paul, no doubt through the Spirit, that he was genuine. And they gave him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. In other words, they gave him their blessing, which was very important then. And they kind of add in verse 10, only that we should remember the poor, the same which I was also forward to do. Now, here's the rub, I think, of this chapter. And when, verse 11, when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. Two apostles, both called by the Lord, have a disagreement. Not the first time it happens in Scripture, not the first time it's ever happened in history. But Paul, who would be considered the Johnny-come-lately of apostles, withstood Peter, the one Jesus named Cephas, rock, because of his hypocrisy. So even after Pentecost, these men and women who were saved were not perfect. They made mistakes. What mistake did Peter make? Let's read about it. Verse 12, for before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. And when they were come, he withdrew himself and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision, which is the Jews. You can find that in Acts chapter 10. And the other Jews disassembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the gospel, truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as the Jews, who were Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentile? Knowing that a man's not justified by the works of the law, but by faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Now, can you imagine that scene? Paul was right, but that had to be hard. That had to be tough to do, because this was Peter, and he was, he was renowned. He was well known. They knew about his restoration. They knew that he was with Jesus, part of the inner circle of disciples, and yet Paul felt confident enough in the Lord that truth is truth. You can't act like you're a Jew when you're around the Jews, and then act like you're a Gentile when you're around the Gentiles. There's one gospel for both. And that's what Peter was doing. So let's talk about that. Let's stop there. That's a lot.